On a warm summer afternoon, the sound of engines roared through the sleepy town of Riverbend. It was a quiet place, where the biggest drama of the week was usually someone's dog chasing the mailman. That peace shattered as a group of leather-clad bikers rolled into the only gas station within 50 miles. The sign creaked, rusted in the midday heat, as the bikers parked, each of their heavy motorcycles gleaming under the sun. Their leader, Tank, a hulking figure with a beard so thick it could probably catch bullets, strutted inside with a swagger. His second-in-command, a wiry man known as Razor, followed close behind, eyeing the sparse selection of snacks and glaring at the few customers who nervously tried to avoid eye contact. The rest of the gang, with names like Viper and Diesel, hung back, leaning on their bikes, exchanging jokes and laughter that sounded a lot more like menacing growls. But among the customers, there was one man who didn't seem to notice the bikers' entrance. He stood by a dusty SUV, slowly refueling the tank. He was a tall, unassuming figure in cargo pants and a well-worn leather jacket. His short, jet-black hair had streaks of gray, and his face carried lines that suggested he'd seen more than his fair share of the world's rough edges. His name was Daniel Graves, but his friends in the military used to call him Gravedigger. Daniel had recently left the army after years of serving in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Now, he was just trying to enjoy a road trip through peaceful towns, far away from explosions and battlefields. But fate, it seemed, wasn't going to let him have that peace today. Tank and Razor stomped out of the gas station, now holding cold drinks and chips they hadn't bothered paying for. Razor, ever the instigator, noticed Daniel and tilted his head with a smirk. Well, look at this," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Who let Grandpa out on the road?" The rest of the gang chuckled, and Daniel didn't so much as flinch. He kept his eyes on the gas pump, not engaging. He had a simple rule: avoid trouble when you can. But Razor didn't seem satisfied with being ignored. He walked over, crunching loudly on a handful of chips, and leaned uncomfortably close to Daniel. "What's wrong, old man? Lost your sense of humor?" Razor taunted, his voice a knife against the peaceful afternoon. Daniel finished pumping the gas and slowly capped the tank. He didn't want to start something, but he could already feel the familiar, unwelcome adrenaline pumping through his veins. He finally turned to face Razor, his blue eyes calm but alert. "Just here to fill up and leave, friend," he said with a tone so even that it should have been disarming. But Razor wanted a reaction. "Friend?" Razor echoed, feigning offense. "We don't look like your friends. Or maybe you're hard of seeing. Or hearing." He took a threatening step closer, and Tank began to chuckle, a deep, rumbling sound that let everyone know trouble was brewing. Just then, one of the more inexperienced bikers, a lanky teenager they called Squid, tried to impress the crew. He revved his bike's engine obnoxiously, startling a small child who had been quietly holding her mother's hand nearby. The little girl burst into tears, and Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't appreciate bullies, especially those who scared kids. He remembered every terrified child he'd seen during missions in war zones, and wasn't about to let these overgrown teenagers ruin this little girl's day. "Enough," Daniel said, his voice carrying a commanding authority that made everyone pause for a heartbeat. The mother of the crying child looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes, but Tank's grin only widened. "Oh, so you do have a spine under that old man jacket," Tank jeered. He stepped forward, and suddenly, all eyes were on Daniel. Daniel sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had really been looking forward to a quiet evening, maybe even a nice roadside diner meal. But this wasn't his first time defusing a situation. "Look," he said calmly, "why don't we all just relax, and you guys can be on your way?" Razor wasn't having it. He shoved Daniel hard, and the soldier stumbled back a step, catching himself against his SUV. The gang erupted into laughter, but that laughter was short-lived. When Daniel straightened, his calm demeanor shifted ever so slightly. His eyes sharpened, like a hawk narrowing in on prey. "Bad idea," Daniel said, almost softly. Razor moved to shove him again, but this time, Daniel moved like lightning. He sidestepped, grabbed Razor's arm, twisted it around, and pinned him against the SUV in a split second. The biker yelped, dropping his chips onto the dusty ground. The rest of the gang sprang into action, but Daniel was already 3 steps ahead. He had been trained for far worse than this. Tank lunged, his fist aiming for Daniel's face, but Daniel ducked and delivered a swift elbow to Tank's ribs, sending the giant stumbling back. Viper swung a chain he'd pulled from his bike, but Daniel caught it, yanked it free, and expertly disarmed him, throwing the chain to the side. The onlookers, who had been holding their breath, began to cheer quietly, amazed by the one-man defense. Squid, the young biker, was now pale and unsure, his hands trembling as he backed away. Diesel, a massive, heavily tattooed biker, roared and tried to tackle Daniel, but the soldier spun and used Diesel's own momentum to send him crashing into a rack of windshield wipers. Diesel groaned, half buried in a pile of car accessories, as Daniel stood there, his jacket still barely rumpled, his breathing steady. Tank wheezed, holding his sore ribs, and looked at his fallen gang members. His face turned red with anger, but there was also fear in his eyes. He wasn't used to losing, and certainly not in such a humiliating fashion. "Who are you?" Tank spat, as if trying to understand how a lone traveler had bested his entire crew. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the mother and the now calm child. "You okay?" he asked gently. The mother nodded, clutching her daughter to her chest, and her eyes shone with gratitude. Daniel turned back to the bikers. "Now," he said, "I suggest you gather your friends, pick up your snacks, and ride out of town before you embarrass yourselves even more." Razor, still pinned to the SUV, whimpered an apology as Daniel let him go. The gang scrambled to get back on their bikes, muttering curses and rubbing sore limbs. They shot Daniel angry looks but knew better than to try again. Tank was the last to leave, glaring at Daniel as if memorizing his face for a future encounter. As the bikers roared off, the gas station's eerie quiet returned. A slow clap began from a man in a trucker's cap, followed by more applause from the small crowd that had gathered. Daniel, ever the reluctant hero, raised a hand in a sheepish wave and walked toward the cashier to pay for his gas. But his peace didn't last long. As he reached the register, a young woman wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform appeared. Her name tag read Deputy Clara Jones, and she looked at Daniel with a mix of admiration and suspicion. "You know," she drawled, "we don't get many heroes around here. You planning to stick around, or should I expect more action with you in town?" Daniel smiled, the lines in his face softening. "Just passing through," he replied, though even he knew that trouble had a way of finding him. No matter where he went, Deputy Clara Jones eyed Daniel with a calculating stare, her hand hovering close to her holstered sidearm. Even though she was young, she had a reputation for being sharp and tenacious. In a town like Riverbend, she'd seen her fair share of bar fights and petty crimes, but never anything like what she just witnessed. The way Daniel had handled those bikers was almost surgical. "Just passing through, huh?" Clara repeated, her voice carrying a hint of doubt. "You took down Tank's whole crew like you've been training for that moment your whole life. Care to share your secret?" Daniel tilted his head, contemplating whether to explain or keep things simple. He decided on the latter. "Let's just say I've had some practice in conflict resolution," he said, his lips quirking in a half-smile. Clara wasn't entirely convinced, but before she could press him further, her police radio crackled to life. A voice came through, urgent and tense. "Deputy Jones, we've got a situation over on Main Street. A 10 to 35 in progress. Report of armed individuals causing a disturbance." Clara's eyes widened, and she grabbed the radio. "Roger that. Heading there now," she responded before turning back to Daniel. "Guess the town's livelier today than usual," she said, almost apologetically. But then she paused, her instincts whispering that perhaps this stranger was more than he seemed. "I tell you to stay out of trouble, but I have a feeling trouble follows you." With that, she sprinted toward her cruiser, lights flashing as she sped off down the road. Daniel rubbed his temple, feeling a familiar sense of dread. His gut told him this was no ordinary day in Riverbend. He was just about to get into his SUV when an elderly man in a cowboy hat approached him. The old man's eyes twinkled with both fear and a peculiar knowing. "Son," the old man said in a raspy voice, I seen trouble like this once before. Strange folks passin' through, stirrin' up chaos. You might want to be careful. Riverbend's got secrets it don't share easily. Daniel furrowed his brows. What do you mean? But the old man just tipped his hat and hobbled away, leaving Daniel with more questions than answers. Curiosity gnawed at Daniel. He didn't consider himself a nosy man, but his instincts had kept him alive through wars and firefights. And right now, those instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. Instead of leaving, he decided to follow the police cruiser, keeping a safe distance. When he turned onto Main Street, the scene was chaotic. A black van had crashed into a storefront, its tires still spinning as smoke poured from the hood. 3 masked men in tactical gear were holding rifles, shouting orders, and waving off terrified onlookers. Clara had taken cover behind her cruiser, her gun drawn, but she was outmatched and outgunned. Daniel cursed under his breath. This wasn't a simple gas station scuffle. This was a full-on assault. But as he scanned the scene, something caught his eye. A familiar symbol painted on the side of the van. It was a black raven, the same emblem he had seen on enemy intelligence reports during his final mission overseas. The mission that had ended with classified chaos and unanswered questions. Impossible, Daniel muttered, feeling the past rush back with a vengeance. One of the masked men, who seemed to be the leader, was shouting into a high-tech communicator. Where's our target? We need to secure the package before we're compromised. The voice was clipped and military, far too organized for a simple robbery. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He'd stumbled into something much bigger than a small-town crime. He moved quickly, slipping into the shadows, his senses on high alert. Clara was pinned down, and innocent people were hiding behind parked cars, trembling. Daniel knew he couldn't stay hidden for long. He had to act, but he needed a plan. Suddenly, a new figure emerged from the chaos. A young woman with wild red hair and piercing green eyes, dressed in a leather jacket and combat boots. She seemed entirely too calm for someone walking into an armed conflict. She approached Daniel's hiding spot, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You must be the infamous gravedigger," she said in a voice that was both amused and serious. "I've heard stories about you." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. This woman wasn't just a random passerby. "And who are you?" he demanded. She smirked. "Name's Fiona. Let's just say I'm here to clean up a mess that you might know something about." She pulled a small, futuristic device from her pocket, one that hummed with energy. "We have a common enemy, soldier. Those guys are not here for money. They're here for something much more dangerous." Daniel's mind raced. Fiona's presence, the symbol on the van, the highly coordinated attack. This was all connected to a covert project he'd thought buried. A project that involved dangerous technology, espionage, and a betrayal that had ended his military career. Fiona leaned closer. "You help me, and maybe we both walk away from this. Otherwise, Riverbend will become ground zero for something you won't be able to stop." Daniel didn't have time to argue. He nodded, his mind already calculating their next move. They had to neutralize the threat, but first, they needed to get Clara and the civilians out of harm's way. Fiona handed him the device. "This can disrupt their comms for a few minutes. Use it wisely." Daniel's heart pounded as he gripped the device. "You've got a plan?" Fiona grinned, her eyes blazing with a mix of recklessness and confidence. "Of course. Just try to keep up, gravedigger." And with that, the unlikely duo sprang into action, ready to face a threat that was much more than either of them had bargained for. Daniel and Fiona moved with practiced precision, each relying on their training and instincts. Fiona activated the device, and a sudden pulse of energy shot through the air. The masked men stumbled, their earpieces crackling with static. For a few crucial moments, their communications were completely jammed. "Now!" Fiona shouted, and Daniel wasted no time. He sprinted across the street, using the element of surprise to disarm one of the gunmen with a brutal takedown. Clara, sensing the tide turning, emerged from her cover and fired a shot that grazed the shoulder of another attacker, forcing him to retreat. Fiona, meanwhile, moved like a whirlwind. She used a combination of quick strikes and acrobatics to disable the last gunman, disarming him with a twist of her wrist. But just as she thought she had him subdued, the man managed to reach into his vest and pull out a small detonator. "Enough games," he growled, his thumb pressing down on the trigger. "We all go down together." Daniel's mind raced. They were out of time. In a split second, he reached for a piece of broken glass from the shattered storefront and flung it with all his strength. The glass sliced through the air, striking the attacker's hand and making him drop the detonator. Fiona lunged, grabbing the device and tossing it away, where it exploded harmlessly in the air. The street fell silent, the only sounds being the crackling of the smoking van and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Clara exhaled, finally lowering her weapon, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Nice throw," Fiona said, offering Daniel a smirk. He just shook his head, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. "I could say the same about your moves," he replied, though he knew there was more to Fiona than met the eye. Before Clara could approach them, Fiona turned to Daniel. "This isn't over. The people who sent those men will come looking for that tech." She gave him a small data chip, her green eyes serious. "Find me when you're ready. We're going to need all the help we can get." Daniel pocketed the chip, a sense of foreboding and purpose mixing in his chest. As Fiona disappeared into the crowd, Clara walked up, her expression a blend of awe and curiosity. "So," she said, raising an eyebrow, "are you ever going to tell me who you really are?" Daniel glanced at the distant horizon, where trouble seemed to be brewing, and gave her a lopsided smile. "Maybe someday," he said, climbing into his SUV. "But today, I'm just a guy passing through." With that, he started the engine and drove away, knowing full well that the secrets he carried had pulled him back into a world he'd tried to leave behind. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Riverbend had been just the beginning, and somewhere, deep in the shadows, a new enemy was already planning their next move.